We're moving on. We're going to talk about a story broken by our Laura, BBC's Laura Kunsberg. Here she is tweeting about it. Eye-watering, one source told me, about Number 10's nominations list for the Lords. Process is not complete, but some pretty interesting politics going on. Brexiteers bête noire, that's your actual French, you know. Philip Hammond could be on his way back into the fold. The other names she mentions are Ken Clarke, maybe not so much of a surprise, and several former Labour MPs who are prominent critics of Jeremy Corbyn. Dan Hannon, what do you make of this?
Well, Ken Clarke was a hugely distinguished figure, and Philip Hammond also was an ex-chancellor. I think it would be an unusual thing if they were to be excluded. I mean, Ken has held he's a substantial figure in every.
Yeah, but let's stick with Philip Hammond. That's the more controversial.
Okay, so
one.
As Secretary of State for Defence, he was one of the first Defence Secretaries actually properly to look at how to get value for money, how to get more bang for our buck. He went on to be a distinguished Foreign Secretary. The government of which he was a member continued to get on top of the debt crisis it had inherited. I think it would be churlish now to focus only on one aspect of disagreement and claim that would negate all the things he'd contributed as a minister.
Yeah, he's been very loyal, isn't he? I mean, this is just another example of the British establishment looking after itself, isn't it?
Well, the Liberal Democrats have long said that we need to reform the House of Lords.
Everybody says that.
That is no surprise. But actually, the bigger issue here, I think, is the politics of what they're trying to show. You know, this is now a Conservative Party that's going to reach out to all of its corners and bring back people back into the fold.
You think it's an olive branch to the Remainers?
I suspect it might be that, but actually it's going to backfire. There were 21 MPs who were fired for speaking out against no deal. I think it's good that 2 of them are in there, because the big thing that we now have to face as a parliament is how do we avoid no deal at the end of this transition? And people like Ken Clarke,
we can't keep changing the definition of no deal.
I mean, she's talking about the future agreement.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so we've got more to come. And, you know, Australia-style trade agreements, what they've been talking about this week, but actually there isn't one. And the point is, we are running out of time, and they are not going to extend the clock. So I'm delighted that someone of the stature of Ken Clarke is in there, but also Philip Hammond, who also people do listen to, will be able to make the case from within the Lords for why we must absolutely avoid that catastrophic no-deal outcome.
What do you make of it?
Well, we have a surfeit, you could say, of people in the House of Lords capable of making the case. You know, we have people like Lord John Kerr, who was our man in Brussels. Absolutely. So we've got plenty of intelligence in the House of Lords in that regard. I'm quite pleased, but on a kind of general level, that Ken Clarke and Philip Hammond are going to come in, because they are One Nation Tories. They are sensible, very experienced people, and there are a large number of the intake into the House across all parties, might I say, over the recent, just the last couple of years, who come in with very little background. And the idea in the House is to have people who've got sufficient hinterland, if you like, to be able to enhance the debate and the arguments. But it's interesting you used the word churlish. I'm not an advocate necessarily for the previous speaker, but I do think it was churlish not to promote him, because every speaker gets promoted.
But I think the phrase you used, a surfeit of people to make the case for the EU, is a beautiful and delicate way of putting it.
So was Philip Hammond right or wrong when he said, we saw him there, he said, I won't have my party taken from me by interests and usurpers who've infiltrated the party ranks to turn it into an extreme right-wing faction.
The idea that Boris, who voted for Ken Clarke as leader, who is a liberal, humane, centrist, mainstream Tory, has allowed the party to be taken over by extremists is something that only really exists in the fantasy of sort of momentum tweeters. A number of people are watching now. But this is not...
Last time I looked, Philip Hammond wasn't in momentum.
Yeah, but there wasn't... Who were these interests?
I didn't say it. I'm asking whether...
And I'm saying that it didn't happen. And the onus is on the people who claim that it did happen to show some evidence.
Can I just say, I don't want to leave this studio tone deaf, so if you would prefer not to shout so, we can all hear you.
No, I think you know, certainly on the ground, I don't know, Daniel, but there are many Conservatives I talk to on the ground who say that that's exactly what's happened within the membership. Yeah. And that's why, you know, Boris Johnson ended up... And there was an anti-Boris Johnson move when that leadership election was
but
going on.
If you're going to say
and
that,
so
I think you need to supply some evidence.
I think there now is a move on his part to recognise the fact he does need to bring that party together.
I really want to knock this on the head. There was this massive fake thing saying that Tommy Robinson had been, you know, and it was just made up. Someone had forged the letter and put it on social media, and everyone was retweeting it. It's just not true.
The bigger issue here is what Boris Johnson's going to be trying to do with Brexit, and he's trying to, you know, reach out. But the fact is, he now owns it. He absolutely owns this policy, and bringing in people like Ken Clarke and Philip Hammond into the Lords is not going to be enough to paper over the fact that whatever happens this year, for good or for bad, he now will own. And I think this is a fig leaf to cover that up.
It's not about the Tory party moving on. The country has moved on. We are talking about other things. The ghastly culture war of the last 3 years has finally come to an end because we've got a policy which I hope will reassure the majority of the 48% that they're worth.
I know you want that to be true. I know you want that to be true.
For me, why does Philip Hammond, who calls his party turning into an extreme right-wing faction, why does he get a peerage and Dan Hannan doesn't?
Oh, this is in hands much higher placed than mine, Andrew. You know.
Is there maybe one coming down the pike?
You know more about it than I do.
Well, I don't know anything. So you're a negative knower of things. Minus.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all viewers when I say that you should be at least a member of the House of Lords.
Will get you everywhere.
That's not going to work, is it? What about Nigel Farage? I mean, we wouldn't have had Brexit if it hadn't been for him. Why hasn't he got a peerage?
I've no idea whether he's going to get a peerage. I mean, the only person who knows that is the PM. But the idea that we're still talking about all of this as though the key dividing issue in the country were Brexit, as though the bill hadn't gone through, as though Britain hadn't left the EU, as though all that hadn't happened, I think is rather sad, because we should be moving on.
Do you seriously think that people out there think, or those of us who are more involved, think that Brexit is actually done? The decision is made.
Yes.
We're coming out, or we're out.
That's what
done
means.
But my God, we're going to be talking about it for Lord knows how long. So the idea that it's kind of done and dusted, forget it, let's move on, it's just ridiculous. Just not going to work like that.
Well, I think actually that is the way most of the countries see it. I was very struck on the day we left. I walked through Parliament Square. For 3 years, there have been red-faced, angry, screaming mobs there, sometimes Leavers, sometimes Remainers, always shouting. On the 31st, they were singing. And I thought, maybe at last we've moved past this wretched tribal culture war
your
and
arguments
something
get
else.
worse and worse.
Dan, I'm sorry. I know you want this to be true, and you want Brexit to be done, but empirically, it's not.
No,
we have months more of negotiation.
Oh, yes. Leaving the EU is Brexit. We've done it. It happened on Friday.
OK, in which case we are now all on the same side, and I hope you agree that we need the closest possible relationship, including staying in the single market and the customs union.
Well, no, the customs union is crazy.
So my point is there are battles still to come, and we are not about to roll over and let Boris Johnson do exactly as he wants.
Of course, we will. If you're now changing the definition of Brexit to mean resolve for all time all outstanding issues with all our neighbours, of course it's never going to be done. Just as we will never definitively resolve all of our issues with Canada or Japan or any other country, because we are now in a process of continuing negotiation.
Well,
but Brexit meant leaving the EU.
This conversation for the moment is done, because I'm losing the will to live.